Good afternoon, good morning. I am Deborah Rosati. I'm the founder and CEO of Women Get On Board. Women Get On Board is a member-based company with over 800 members across Canada, and our mission is to connect, promote, and empower women to corporate boards. And our goal is quite simply to get one more woman on a board, one board at a time. I want to begin our Women Get On Board speaker series virtual event today by acknowledging the land in which I live is in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Hautesinys. The Upper Canada Treaties cover this territory and is within these lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon, the Waabam Agreement, and is directly adjacent to the Haldimand Treaty territory. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to enjoy the natural surroundings of this territory. I encourage all of us to become actively involved in understanding why land acknowledgements are important and in understanding Indigenous histories and contemporary Indigenous issues in Canada. Women Get On Board is delighted to be hosting this virtual event speaker series with our sponsor, UBS Investment Bank. We are excited to have a fireside chat with Anelia Crawford, Managing Director of the ESG Advisory Group at UBS Investment Banks, and Mary Larson, a partner at MMP. They will focus on the S of the ESG. As we know, social and racial injustice has become an emerging topic around the boardroom table, and Anelia will uncover all of the emerging issues that on the S of the ESG that as board members you need to be considering. By way of background, Anelia was formerly UBS's Global Head of Activism and Defense. She's currently and just recently taken on the Managing Director and America Head of the ESG Advisory Group of UBS. She has over 15 years of experience in corporate governance, shareholder activism, M&A, and she's advised hundreds of major activism contests for controlling, including campaigns in the United States, Europe, Japan, Canada, Austria, Australia, and Latin America. Very global in nature. So I am not going to go any further in your bio because everyone else has had a chance to review it. You have amazing experience to bring to the table. So I am going to turn the session over to you, Anelia. I know you have a lot to share and you have an amazing guest with you on your fireside chat. So over to you, Anelia.
Thanks, Deborah. It's truly a pleasure to be with all of you today, and thank you for joining us because we really are, I think, in a terrific position to have a phenomenal discussion here on issues that are important and make them very practical. And I am excited because I'm joined by Mary Larson, and you can see what an illustrious career she has with this bio that we are all seeing on the screen. Mary is a partner in MNP Consulting. She leads the firm's national organizational renewable practice. Based in Montreal, I believe, but a very well-traveled, as we have discovered in our prep chat. Working with some of the brand names around the globe in North America and South America, and helping really top of those houses, the C-suite, the CEOs, public company directors, like many of you on this call, I expect, to really formulate their strategies, to develop their leadership capacities and their culture, so that we can all be well-equipped and count on our corporations to focus on some of the ESG issues to be tackled here in our current and in our future. So thank you, Mary, so very much on joining us today. I think Mary and I are focused on having this discussion be as practical and useful for all of you as we possibly can. So we have planned some questions in a discussion, if you will, that will hopefully be practical, as I mentioned, in the first 45 minutes or so, but then we will open the floor so that you can ask us questions and help us target the specific areas that are of interest to you. And with that, welcome, Mary.
Thank you so much. This is going to be very enjoyable. It's a topic that I really love talking about. So too bad we can't be in the same place though.
Yeah, well, these are the days, but
Right.
we'll still try to make this as interactive and interesting and useful for people as we can.
Right.
And I'm gonna start by setting a little bit the foundation, if you will, for all of this. ESG, particularly for some who are in the more skeptical camp, is something relatively ambiguous, so broad, it's hard to define, it's hard to quantify. A lot of senior leaders are grappling with what does that really mean in terms of their responsibilities, and how exactly are they expected to deal with this. And the S in the ESG, which is the focus of social issues, which is the focus of our conversation today, is perhaps out of the three the one that most people really have the most issue with in terms of understanding what is the scope of the S. Is it just about being a decent human being, doing good? How do we quantify it? How do we view the parameters of what S is? So help us all dive into this by giving us a sense of tangibly what does the S stand for in terms of corporates.
So I think that it's a very good question, and I think we're hearing a lot today around why pay attention to anything other than the E part of ESG. And The Economist came out with an opinion piece about a month and a half ago, or maybe a couple of months ago, that just said, forget about the rest of ESG. We should only focus on the E. It's also the case that the ISSB and that is initially focused on coming up with frameworks around environmental aspects of ESG. And of course, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is focused on climate-related disclosures. So I think a lot of people think that we can sort of almost ignore this. But COVID, I think, and a lot of things that happened during COVID brought a lot of these issues to the fore. And interestingly, most of them are highly measurable and quite tangible. Some of them are internal. So if you think about working conditions, safety and worker safety, customer data privacy is certainly one of them. Equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is a very complex topic and fraught with a lot of discussion these days, and culture, which can be measured. So those are the internal ones. The external ones have more to do with things like modern slavery and human rights. But the thing that's interesting is that even though people are saying we don't have to pay attention to these, there are way too many movements and things happening in the world that are driving these to the top of the heap in terms of concerns for boards. One is the Me Too movement. There has definitely been slippage in gender parity or equity over the past couple of years, but and some rights are under attack in the US, as we all well know, which is just tragic. But the Me Too movement sort of put things on the front burner with respect to gender equity. I think as well, we've got a lot of data that's related to anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and over-incarcerated and over-policed citizens, both Black and Indigenous. And then the Black Lives Matter movement, which really took pace after the Floyd George murder. And then there are things that have also happened that kind of stick in people's memories. The fire in Bangladesh, the Joe Fresh factory that burned and all these people died, it had a significant impact on Loblaw's brand. And then modern slavery. There are 25 million people in the world who are in forced labor. And that's not just people in Uyghur cities, but all over the world. And then we've had things that are particularly relevant to Canadians with respect to our involvement in mining. So there have been a lot of dam failures around the world, in Canada, Brazil, and China, where tailings have killed many, many people. And then there's some, the data breaches that we hear about all the time. And in fact, one of the things that I learned in a recent course, in a course that I'm taking right now on ESG is that it is inevitable that your company will be breached at some point and your customer data will be, at least there will be an attempt to tamper with it. There's some other stories that I've heard that haven't necessarily made the press, but one of our clients told us, no, it was actually something that we met at a conference. He was the head of, I think, supply chain at American Eagle. They lost their whole year's shipment of fabric because they couldn't prove that human slavery or forced labor hadn't been involved in the manufacture of it. I've noticed that a lot of American Eagle stores are closed. I don't know if there's a direct link, but could be, couldn't manufacture anything at the last minute. So, I mean, that these things are just amazingly serious. They are getting a lot of press coverage. And as I said, I think that, you know, COVID and all of the other things that we're hearing about with, you know, the Ukraine war, these things are all sort of keeping these things front and center, although we obviously aren't forgetting about climate change.
Yeah, I love the American Eagles reference there because it brings it into the practical implications of this. And so what do you say to people who challenge whether public companies should be the ones to target these issues? I mean, yes, they sound very, very important, of course, but I don't know if you have the same experience. In my experience, very frequently, I will speak to CEOs and they will say, well, that's not for my company to solve, right? I'm responsible to our shareholders. I have a business to run. Am I the one who's supposed to resolve all the evil in the world? Why should it be public companies that care?
Well, I think that because the risks to your company, if you don't pay attention to these things, are enormous. And so we're not asking companies to go out and be missionaries and change the world. But you know, if you think about what's going on with today's workers and with EDI in particular, people want to work in companies that are diverse. They want to bring themselves to work. If there is a reputation associated with a company that it is not welcoming to women, to equity deserving groups, and that, you know, people are not going to want to work there. People leave, and we all know that the cost of replacing an employee is significant. I've heard a lot of pushback. I know that with respect to inflation and the impending recession, people are saying, you know, this whole EDI thing is just, I'm not going to, you know, I don't want to bother with it anymore. But if you can't hire the people you need to hire and keep them, this is a problem. Yeah. And worker safety is so clearly an issue. I mean, if you think about regulatory fines, damage to reputation, insurance, and claims costs, I had a really interesting conversation with a board member in Alberta a couple of years ago who said that she thought that every company that had any potential issues with respect to worker safety ought to be moving towards 0 deaths, not just a percentage. And they ought to actually be naming the person who died or naming the person who was hurt, because this brings it down to a sense of reality. If you knew that person who was killed or who was hurt, that somehow brings it down to some sense of reality that is much more important. And I'm sorry, if you have a data breach and your customer's data is destroyed, they're not going to be happy with you. And so you've got insurance risk, reputational risk. And although we don't have, the US is much further ahead with us with respect to modern slavery. You do have to demonstrate that your goods that you're bringing into the US are free of modern slavery or forced labor. Canada is moving to that, but we're not there yet. But we face big problems when we try to export to the US. So this is getting in the way of business. It's getting in the way of hiring people, buying the goods that you want to buy, selling the things you make, and potentially losing customers because you aren't protecting your data.
So it actually, as I'm listening to you, I think you're busting 2 myths about the social issues that are very frequently misunderstood in top of house circles for companies. The one, that the social issues cannot be quantified. But you're pointing out, yes, of course they can. You can count diversity numbers. You can tell how many women you have in your workforce. You can tell from a safety point of view how many injuries you have. This is data that's readily available, right? There's a lot in terms of human capital management. There's a lot in terms of diversity and equity and inclusion. It's very tangible, whether there are human rights violations. So a lot of this is actually very, very quantifiable, contrary to some misunderstandings. And myth number two, this is not just about being decent. This is
No.
a very integral business issue. To your example about the American Eagle, you can have your stores closed, you can lose an employee, as you're saying. You can use, you can disrupt your relationships with consumers whose data is breached. There's real business implications for this.
Right. Now, are you seeing? I mean, I have to say, Amelia, that it is not clear to me that all boards are really paying much attention to, although I'm going to talk about some things that they could be doing. But what about the US? Are you seeing the same sense of, I mean, I do think companies in Canada are paying attention to this increasingly, but what about the US? What's going on there?
I think it is a very interesting contrast, and thank you, Mary, for asking this, but I think that we are seeing two divergent, if you will, forces in the US that are pushing. On the one hand, you have all these macro factors like the Me Too movement and racial justice. A lot of this is just a general societal, I think, understanding that well-being is very important to companies. Further, I think also highlighted by the pandemic and everything we have learned from the pandemic with hybrid working, sort of mental burnout, to people's completely new sense of what flexibility looks like in terms of lifestyle and how you balance work. All of these issues, I think, are on the one hand brewing as very important catalysts for why corporations understand that they are losing employees potentially if you don't get this right. They're losing customers if they don't get it right. They're using suppliers if they don't get it right, etc. On the other hand, there's the people who I think are distancing themselves even more aggressively, as you're pointing out. So they're trying to say, we are seeing all these big risks to our society. Let's focus on resolving those. We'll deal with ESG later. So I think that it's very much along the lines of what you're describing. That's been my experience as well. And I think that it also begs the question to what I'm about to ask you next, which is who should have responsibility here? I think a lot of our audience today is public company directors. And it is one of the things that I think a lot of companies are struggling with. Is it enough to hire a chief sustainability officer, give them certain responsibilities, put them in an office here and
No.
treat them as a separate function? Do boards have to get involved in this? To our discussion so far, a lot of these issues could be viewed as management oversight type of issues. Who should have ownership over these things?
It's a very important question, and I think at both the board level and at the management level, these things, they do rise up at I mean, the CEO is probably ultimately responsible for these things, and I want to emphasize one aspect that both the board and the management team need to pay very close attention to. We haven't really delved into it. So, and culture is one of these S's, and culture can be measured. And one of the things that I learned from talking to 55 board members in Canada of public companies a couple of years ago is they are all concerned about culture. And a lot of the things that we've just talked about have to do with organizational culture. I mean, how things are done in an organization. And it has been demonstrated that something on the order of 90% of implementation failures due to counterproductive cultures. So if you take as a premise that you can measure culture, which you can, and as you take as a premise, if you take as a fundamental belief that bad cultures get in the way of getting things done, then you find yourself in the situation of one of our clients who basically have said, if we don't get our culture right, we're not going to get anything done. We're not going to be successful no matter how good our strategy is, no matter how good our systems are, no matter how good our hiring, our diversity might be, because we'll lose all the people we hire. you raised the point. So I think everybody in the organization is responsible for culture. I think the CEO of an organization has to make sure that his or her senior team is the supply chain people, the procurement people, HR, finance are paying attention to this set of topics that we've been talking about. And what I'm seeing is boards are starting to do some really interesting things. They are taking on some very hard responsibilities and demanding data. And so they're looking for culture measurement. They're saying, I don't want just an engagement survey. I'd like to actually understand how the culture works in this organization. I'd like to have access to employees and see what they're saying about what it's like to work in this company. Internal audit, which is something that our firm does, we are increasingly being asked to audit HR practices, which is something we've never done before. HR committees are taking on EDI factors. They're asking for organizations to do demographic surveys and report on the degree to which there is diversity. They're looking for data being factored into scorecards. So turnover and the reasons for people leaving. So it's not just the turnover, but why people left. Diversity measures, measures of reported accidents, incidents of aggression or discrimination, and workplace accidents and risks. So they're asking for data. And they are asking really tough questions about where are you buying your materials and where are you selling and who are you selling to? And then review protocols for data protection recovery. I think the other thing that boards are realizing is agency risk is huge. You cannot rely on, oh, we've got someone overseeing that mine in Bhutan, or they don't have mines in Bhutan because Bhutan wouldn't let them, but in Thailand, wherever it might be, because you as a board member are going to be held accountable if there's a dam breach. And you can't rely on a middleman for, who's going to be buying your materials, because you will be held accountable if something goes wrong. So I think boards are starting to be aware of the monetary risk and the reputational risk and the regulatory risk that is associated with these factors. They know they can measure these things, and that you're right about this myth. Culture, all these things are measurable. It's just, and it's when companies get hit with these things that they realize, oh my God, why didn't I pay attention before?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for making this point that culture can be measured, because that is one of the one that really people don't understand what that means exactly, and how it can be measured, but it can, and it has very serious implications. And I have to say, I was meeting a set of companies in Japan, actually, and it was quite interesting to see they're trying to model what some of their Western investors are expecting from them. But there was a huge difference between a number of companies that had built ESG teams and given them the responsibility to write sustainability reports. And the interaction of these ESG teams or a single sustainability officer with the business function was tenuous at best.
Right.
And it was viewed as tension, even in some instances, because the business people are frustrated and the ESG team doesn't understand their revenue generating initiatives here, and the sustainability people are frustrated that they're not getting the information they need to put these sustainability reports together. And that creates the real issue there, because then you have a document that is prepared by people that do not they're not integrated in the business function. It's just a marketing document that has nothing to do with the day-to-day practices that this company has. So I agree with you that CEO's direct oversight of these functions is super important. I find, I'll ask you about the pitfalls you have seen, but I've seen in some instances social issues being parked under HR with no connectivity to businesses and no direct reporting of the social issues to CEOs. I find that matrices, if you will, where business folks with important jobs are part of the effort, work much better. And the other thing is also deciding who within the board, and that depends on the business in my view, but it would be very interesting to hear, Mary, if you find something different, who within the board should oversee it? Should it be a risk management function, to your point about the enterprise risk? Should it be under the audit committee? Should there be a separate ESG committee? Should the full board be responsible because it is such an important issue? In some instances, some of these issues are covered by the Nom/Gov committee, since some of it is also involved in the governance aspects of all these. In some instances, it's comp committees because it's part of the executive compensation. What pitfalls have you seen, and what best practices advice do you have in terms of the structure?
Well, I do want to address both those issues around reporting and about board responsibility. First of all, that many of our clients have asked us to do reviews of their sustainability reports, and we look at a particular industry, whether it's auto parts or food manufacturing or you name it, financial institutions. And one of the most egregious things to have happen in sustainability reporting is to have marketing take over the responsibility for it. And I can't tell you, if I see a 95-page sustainability report, I would be ready to throw it in the trash. They should be 10 pages. The data, the objectives should be set up that in such a way that they are in fact, based on benchmark data, so that you all not only have where you're starting from, but where you sit with respect to other players in your sector. You need to measure your progress every year. You need to have numbers and facts. Forget all the stuff about having donated money to softball teams and having participated in races. It doesn't matter. It may be nice for your community, but it doesn't matter. And we've had many conversations with very large companies, including one big bank that got called to task publicly 2 weeks ago for greenwashing in their sustainability report. And I can name the name because it was in the newspapers, the Royal Bank of Canada. And they were very guilty of not having facts, of having very poor data. And so, their people in their operations were not supplying the people who were writing the report with the data that they needed. If you think about the range of issues that we've talked about, it's people, it's supply chain, it's those are very important things. It's data, so it's IT. I think it's what has to happen if you've got a very powerful and strong group of people who are focused on ESG inside the company, they have to be empowered. And one of the things I think we saw that in the previous session that I had with the head of sustainability at Export Development Canada, she is part of line management and is actually responsible for innovation and product development. So she has a seat at the table. I don't think you can possibly give this to one committee. I'm not a big fan of ESG committees of the board. Most organizations that are doing a really good job have taken each of their committee mandates and have rewritten them to specifically include oversight around certain issues that relate to the environment, that relate to governance, that relate to social issues. And that's best practice. And there have to be, and the chair obviously needs to feel very responsible for this. The other thing that in the reading that I've done and in the conversations that I've been having with organizations, the buck stops with the CFO. And so it's, we all always talk about, CEO is responsible for this. The CFO is responsible for all those numbers. So CFOs need to be as expert as they could possibly be around ESG issues, all of them. And so that's kind of it's a tougher job every year. I wouldn't want to be a CFO of a publicly held company now. It's a big responsibility.
It is, and I couldn't agree more. I love your example about the sustainability reports. I do my share of reading them, and I find it amazing how challenging it seems to be for some companies to identify what's important to their business.
35 material factors.
Yeah, it's really, and I mean, I recently, I won't mention the name of the company, but it was a global food distributor. And I read through their 117 page or something along those lines report. And it occurred to me that this company, which uses trucks to drive around food, and 40% or something like this of that is meat, did not identify trucking or the deforestation that is associated with meat production anywhere in their sustainability report. They had spent their sustainability reports as 117 pages talking about the electricity they use in their facilities and partnerships with local farms and how they're giving money, etc. So it was just absolutely stunning, such a huge omission in terms of what's at the core of your operations, in terms of identifying where genuinely, your ESG factor risks are, and with a lot of industrial safety, for example. If I read a sustainability report for an industrial company and there's no injuries list, to your point about safety, then you've dismissed it. So let me jump a little bit to Canadian specific focus and ask you, are there any social issues that are particularly important here in Canada, or there in Canada, I should say, because I'm in New York, that that you think directors in Canadian companies should be aware of and particularly focused on?
I think all of them are important, but and I doubt there's much of a difference between across the developed world. But I do think that in Canada in particular, diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly as it relates to not only people of various ethnicities, including Blacks and people from all over the world, but obviously Indigenous people. And I think that those issues, not everywhere in the country. I mean, I'm in a part of the country where this just isn't, it's remarkably non-diverse part of the country, but in most parts of Canada, truth and reconciliation and what's going on with Indigenous rights, the fact that Deborah has, and everybody that I know, frankly, these days is highly conscious of our responsibility and our accountability. So I'd say that would be the one that I would kind of highlight as something that we ought to be paying attention to.
Yeah. And let me jump now to something you referenced earlier. You made a reference to the Economist article. I think that probably everyone in this space has read it. It was a special report, but it's not the only one. We're seeing a little bit of a backlash. I think we can all agree that there is a lot of, the debate has become more heated, and there are definitely forces, if you will, and even intelligent, if you will, sources that are making the argument. There's a variety of arguments. Some of them are that ESG should not exist as a separate categories. Some of them are arguing that maybe the E, the S, and the G don't belong together. What have you seen in terms of backlash, and what's your reaction in terms of what's happening out there on that front?
I think that one of the biggest problems right now is rating agencies, and this was something that was problematic in the meltdown in 2007, 2008, is the rating agencies weren't connected with reality. And when I did a recent comparison of reports in the auto parts industry, each of them was using 3 or 4 different rating agencies, and across those rating agencies, they got scores all the way from D to A+ with the same company, depending on the rating agency, because they're measuring different things. Yeah. And so I think, therefore, it is important that investors stop relying on rating agencies, that they actually do their homework, that they ask boards and CEOs and companies to actually come up with good data about what they're really doing that is benchmarked and that is, reliable, because there are ratings for reliability of data. And if you've got a 5 on your reliability, that means you're in deep trouble. So I think people would, that would be one thing, is the confusion caused by the rating agencies is an excuse on the part of many investors to say this isn't important, this is not real. I think that increasingly the backlash around companies saying that, oh, this isn't really important, I don't really have to pay attention to it, when you get caught with a greenwashing controversy and it goes into the press, I think that this is, it's going to mitigate this tendency on the part of many CEOs and boards and investors to say, I don't really have to pay attention to this. The press is paying attention and citizens are paying attention. So I think there is a sense of fatigue, but these are counterbalancing forces. And we certainly have something very interesting in Gen Y coming up. These people are very smart, very demanding, very loud. And I think that's going to help as well. So sometimes I get depressed. I have my days. But what I'm finding is with most of the CFOs and the CEOs I talk to, they take it seriously. The problem is many people do get caught in this problem of saying, oh, I have 35 material factors. How do I measure them all? Well, that's where people get into trouble. If they can just start to link this with their core business, then I think it becomes much more manageable and something that people can get their heads around and actually do something about.
I couldn't agree more. I had a conversation with the founder of a fund that's an ESG focused fund. And we were talking about how important some of these factors are and how he interacts with the public companies that he invests in. And he told me something that was very interesting. He was explaining his strategy in terms of investing in car manufacturers. And he said, I speak to each one of these CEOs and they all tell me what commitments they've made to go to electric fleets, if you will, by X years. They have all these targets. But I know that there's not enough lithium in the world for that to be possible. So when I sit down with a CEO and I try to understand on the environmental and social and governance aspects what their plan is, I want to understand that they have identified the 2-3 core things that really matter to their business and that they have formulated a real strategy to hit their targets so that it is not a matter of just wishing that you'll get there by a certain year and kicking the buck down the road, in many instances even thinking that you're not going to be in this job as a CEO to be responsible for whether or not you get there. So I think I very strongly agree with this materiality, if you will, assessment, knowing what's at the core of the business. And I think that one of the things I hear in the US have to deal with frequently is BlackRock's voting decisions recently have also been a little bit of a pullback from that.
What's going on there? This with the AGs and all this.
Well, there's 2 things that are happening. One is the fact that BlackRock has now not supported, in all instances, proposals around ESG that have been put by shareholders. And so many are saying, BlackRock, you think that that purpose is so important, that all of these social initiatives should be important for the companies, yet your voting decisions are not consistent with that. And BlackRock defended their position by saying, no, they are, except that we are expecting companies to take a very case-by-case approach to their own circumstances and shareholders as well. We cannot have one size fit all for all these companies, because this means that we are now having investors micromanage companies. We are not customizing enough the approach for each company. And that's why if you want our support, you have to have a much more thoughtful and intelligent proposal on what makes sense for this company. And then in terms of the AGs, that is a little bit of another backlash, if you will. I don't know if people are familiar with this, but 19 attorney generals of different states in the United States, for no one will it be a secret that this is a politicized issue in the States, but 19 attorney generals sent a letter to BlackRock saying that BlackRock incorporating ESG factors in terms of their investment and voting decisions was inconsistent with their fiduciary duties to the pension plans and the mom and pop investors whose money they manage, because they're supposed to be solely focused on maximizing returns. And so when you're looking at social factors and how good these companies are on this front, you're taking your eye off the ball in terms of maximizing returns. And BlackRock, I think, very persuasively defended themselves saying, no, we look, very much to your point, Mary, we look at these factors in terms of determining how well a company is run. For us, this is a business management decision. Our job is to make investments that in companies that will, for the long term, be more valuable. And we think that these factors inform how valuable these companies will be down the road. Therefore, it's very consistent with what we're supposed to be doing for our clients.
It's a question of business resilience, right?
Business resilience, absolutely.
And having you alluded to this, if you said that water usage is big for your business, or if it's gasoline with delivery trucks or lithium or whatever, you have to have those interim plans for what you're going to be doing in year 3, year 5, year 10, so that you can actually measure this. And so maybe you are doing pretty badly on some factors that are material right now, but if you have a plan for how you're going to get there, an investor is much more likely to look at you positively than if you're not doing anything, or if you can't demonstrate you're doing something.
Yeah. And I get the question from many companies. I'd be curious to hear if you get that. But a lot of executives, in particular, more so than board members, CEOs, would ask about, will this be reflected into my valuation, right? It's wonderful to have women in the workforce. It really is. It's terrific to have all of these, to have hybrid working and training programs, culture, great. Will it be reflected in my valuation? And can you show me the data that today public companies' valuation changes depending on whether or not they're good ESG citizens? And it's a really, really tough question that we being bankers struggle with all the time, because that's what we need to show our clients. And I have to say, initially, we would spend a lot of time explaining why valuations in North America, in particular in the States, mostly don't quite reflect positive ESG behavior. It's a variety of things. It's a single factor. You can't link value. You can establish a cause and effect, which is 1. 2, there is no reliable data for ESG primary investors. Our laws have not caught up with us in order to be able to assess these things. There's a lot of other things, but it really boils down to companies not being able to show how their behavior on some of these environmental and social and governance issues translates into financial performance benefits. And that's why I think that your insights as to how measurable these things are on the social front, which is so frequently criticized for being too unquantifiable, are super illuminating. They are measurable. They can be explained in terms of financial benefits, and companies should be able to see that in their valuations ultimately if they succeed.
I think, yeah, and it does get down to, for example, one of my clients is in the hospitality sector, and one of their large hotels, they have not been able to open their restaurants more than 3 nights or 4 nights a week, and they can actually measure the lost revenue and profitability that is due to the fact that they are having trouble hiring people, which has to do, actually, they're very responsible people and they're very nice and their ethics are great, but everybody is having that problem. And many companies who are not necessarily treating their employees the right way, they can measure the cost of turnover. And if it's something that you probably, I think somebody needs to do the study that was done about 10 years ago that did have, was able to measure the equivalent, the linkage between positive and healthy cultures and return on investment and growth. That should be done probably for a number of ESG factors at this point. I'm sure there are people at Harvard Business School at NCI working on this, but I haven't seen the studies yet.
So Mary, this is all terrific. I think that we probably have to jump into our Q&A session. Deborah, I will pass it on to you since you have visibility over the chat room, and you can tell us if there are any questions that people are shooting our way.
Well, Amelia and Mary, the Q&A is blowing up. So lots of great questions. I'm smiling because hopefully we can get through them. But before we begin, I just want to say great conversations, Mary and Amelia, just so practical and bringing it home on the realities. And again, it's not a myth out there anymore. It's a reality. So, so let's begin with the first question. It was in general, what are the speakers' thoughts on how climate change is affecting the S in the ESG? And maybe we'll start with you, Mary.
How,
you want me to reread? Yeah, I'll reread.
Yeah.
Yeah. How, so what are your thoughts on how climate change is affecting the S in the ESG?
Well, that's a really interesting question that I've never thought of quite in the same way. I think that what has happened with when we're thinking about the E side of ESG and climate change, there has been a heavy focus put on supply chains. And once you start looking at your supply chains, you're actually starting to ask questions about who's supplying you with what. And then you say, well, are the working conditions for the people who are supplying you appropriate? Are we doing things with employees or with people that are working in factories from whom we buy? Are they in safe working conditions? And I think the same thing starts to happen when you get to the other end of the value chain and you think about to whom you're selling and how you're selling things. It becomes an issue where you're thinking about your own workers' safety, your own workers' working conditions, and you know the impact that this might have on your business. So I think it would mostly be the supply chain linkage. But Amelia, what do you think?
I think so too. I think it's an excellent question, and it goes to the core of, can we treat the E and the S and the G separately, or are they integrally linked and we have to tackle them all together? And I firmly believe it is the second. And it's precisely for the reasons that Mary is explaining, which is to say, some of the environmentally most significant challenges the companies face hit the most socially vulnerable. So if we zoom out and we look at this on a macro scale, right? The biggest disasters happen in Africa, where there's such profound poverty. I mean, this is taking it really to the macro. But if we were to try to deal with the E without thinking about the S, I think we would, as humankind, and this can be brought down to the micro of each individual company just the same, we will find ourselves widening the gap, right? Think about the energy transition. Who is it affecting negatively? Coal miners don't have jobs. On the other hand, Silicon Valley is thriving with the technology that's helping us decarbonize. With every single thing that we deal with, or even within a single company, right? When we are electrifying and improving our processes so that we consume less and there's less water consumption and this and that, is the manual laborers that lose their jobs. So however you want to zoom it out or in, the negative impact from our transition on the environmental issues or failure to deal with it in terms of catastrophes that cause supply chain disruptions affects the people who are most vulnerable and at the bottom of the social ladder. And so unless we are able to establish some level of fairness, we're going to have really profound political and social issues in our future. And that's why there's this whole concept of just transition, just all capitalized, because it is so important not just to do it, but how we do it in a way where we can emerge on the other end as a functioning society or functioning companies or however you want to look at.
I have a really quick example too, and I know there are other questions, but one of the organizations we work with is an organization that is investing in mining operations to look for battery related materials like lithium and things like that. And one of the things that they're realizing that they have to do with respect to their oversight is take on a whole set of capabilities and investments to make sure that the people working in the mines in which they invest have safe working conditions. So it's exactly what Amelia is talking about. These things are so intertwined, you cannot separate them really. And there's a governance. I mean, there's a whole other governance issues there too.
Well, I think you both did a really great job of sort of really tying that back of how important the E, the S, and the G as an integrative thinking from a business strategy and overall the sustainability of a business. So got more questions. So I'm going to go to the next one. There are so many priorities for business and board leaders. When it comes to prioritizing diversity as a business strategy, i.e. ESG, how can companies move from just representation to behavioral shifts where accountability is tied to performance and deliverables? Did you get the question? You want me to reread it?
Was it diversity or ESG overall?
It was when it comes to prioritizing diversity as a business strategy. So as part of a focus area. And then the follow on is, if that's the case, then how can companies move from just having representation, i.e. ticking the box, to behavioral shifts where accountability is tied? And I think it kind of goes back to greenwashing, green wishing,
right,
where you can kind of say we have these numbers, but is it really having the impact, and how do you tie it to performance and deliverables?
So yes, this is the performative aspect of EDI strategies. And we right now, I think I'm helping about 5 organizations develop their EDI strategy. And
Mary, just pause on that. Just for the purposes of everyone, maybe just do the full definition of EDI, because there's so many acronyms.
Yes, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think this is so similar to the conversation that Amelia and I were having about materiality. Every organization, you can measure whether you've got how many people who are equity deserving, whether it's gender or racial or whatever it might be, and you can carry out demographic surveys to measure this. But unless you have been very, very specific about what it is that you are going to do to hire people in a different way, bring them into an organization in a different way, treat them as they're doing performance well in their jobs, and adjust your performance management system so that it is as bias-free as possible. It is you can do the equivalent of the sustainability report where it's yada yada yada. And I think that what we've been finding is that in any organization, there are different aspects of whether or not an organization values inclusion, has put policies in place, has actually made sure that the way those policies are implemented reflects the intent of the policy. They differ by company, they differ by the situation that you're in. I talked to the Commissionaires of Canada, which are a very interesting group of people. They actually hire veterans and put them into security roles. And they are very focused on the S side of ESG. And what they have really focused on is making sure that people are well trained and well compensated and protected in their jobs. And so they're doing a really nice job on diversity, but they've been very specific about it. And you have to, it's the same thing that Anelia and I have been talking about. It's measuring things and tailoring what you're doing to your business and making sure that things aren't performative, because that's really awful. And people
Anelia, do you want to
Absolutely.
any comments there?
I do. I'll make 2 comments. In addition, I couldn't agree more with Mary. Again, we're like so aligned on all this. But so talking about representation, for example, versus true performance, there's plenty of studies out there that show that having a single woman on your board is not nearly as impactful as having 3 or more. And with the more you get, that there are actual, real, measurable performance-related, benefits from having that diversity in your boardroom. So I think that in some ways we're past the point where we have to even prove at this stage that that's a benefit for the company. But so that's comment number 1. Comment number 2, it is also to Mary's point about doing it for real and make it a very cultural. So I'll give you the example of UBS, for example. We still have our targets, and that have not been hit in terms of how many women we want to have in senior positions and all of this. Like every company out there, we have our aspirations. But that, to me, that's great. But you have to go multiple levels deeper, right? You have to have a strategy about retaining women. You have to have a strategy about promoting women and attracting them. So UBS, for example, makes sure that there is a female interviewee in every single job position interview, in addition to a female candidate. But it also, there's also a system where we all have a lot more feedback that we receive and are given more responsibility over decisions that can impact how the company is being run. I spoke earlier, and I don't want to make this a promo piece for UBS, it's just that's my experience most recently, so I'm trying to give it an example. There was a panel that we did with managing directors in investment banking, and so there's 4 of us who were supposed to give career advice, and I was expecting this junior crowd of women who are looking for tips how to navigate their careers. Our most senior leaders were there with a 50-50 male and female crowd. It almost felt uncomfortable because I was there giving career advice to all my bosses who are men and dealing with very different issues. But I walked out of there thinking, this is real. This is how you do it. You actually focus on the aspects where you can show women that they're valued, give them actual decision-making power. You trickle it down everywhere. So it's not just the superficial numbers. We have, okay, great, we have a woman on our board. Done. Clearly not the case.
No.
So I just want to tie that up. There's a saying out there that diversity is having a seat at the table, inclusion is having a voice, and belonging is having that voice heard.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that kind of sums it all up. So I'm mindful of our time. We do have some additional questions, but what I would say to anyone that didn't get their questions answered, because we're very mindful of finishing at 1 o'clock, I know that both Mary and Anelia would love to hear from you. So if you're okay, Anelia and Mary, if anyone wants to link in with you, feel free to, if you didn't get your questions asked, because they were very good questions and very targeted, but you can see both Mary and Anelia's passion for the topic. So I'm going to thank both.
I was just going to say one thing. I'm happy to take the questions and send out a written response to them too. So if that would
there was only a couple left. So
okay.
I think anyone, I think for those that didn't get, that would be my suggestion, Mary, rather than creating work.
Okay.
Anyone that had any questions that we didn't answer, I feel reach out to Anelia and Mary, great way to connect with them, because part of what we do at Women Get on Board is making connections. So great way to do that. So thank you, Anelia. Thank you, Mary, for sharing your passion and your really practical insights and tips. You both have depth and breadth of experiences in this topic, and really geared to, from a board perspective, what should you be thinking about on the E of the ESG, and being mindful that it's fully integrated. It's not just a silo for the social aspect of what boards and companies should be thinking about. So on behalf of Women Get on Board, we'd like to thank you for your time, and we will be making a donation to Dress for Success. And I just saw on LinkedIn that that Trudeau was visiting Dress for Success in Toronto. So he's obviously trying to understand the importance of helping empower women of that might be marginalized from marginalized communities. So we're really happy to make that donation on your behalf to our charity partner, which is Dress for Success Toronto. And thank you, UBS Investment Bank, for being our sponsor for today's speaker series. Our next Women Get on Board speaker series is December 2nd, and the focus will be, it'll be the third of our 3-part series, and it'll be around the G of the ESG. So stay tuned. Hope you can join us. Following this session, you'll receive a link. We'd love to get your feedback. So love to get your feedback. There'll also be a link to the upcoming session on December 12th. And there'll be a recording in the next few days. And there will be a blog on this particular topic that will come out in the next 10 days or so. So happy autumn to you all. Thank you. Stay safe and be well.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.